Welcome to the Living Out podcast, helping people, churches and society talk about faith and sexuality.
Hello and welcome to the Living Out podcast. My name is Adam and I'm joined today by Andy.
Hello, Adam.
Hello, Andy. Now, here in the UK, we are in the midst of the election season, and in the first leaders' debate, the two hopeful prime ministers were asked a question which apparently came from Gareth Southgate. He asked, what is your best leadership approach? Play it safe or take some risks and go for the win? So, Andy, my opening question for you on this Living Out podcast is, does Living Out have an official position on this? What is a good leadership approach? Should you play it safe or should you take a risk?
I think it depends which of us you talk to. So anybody listening to this who knows me well will know play it safe is my entire personality. I'm not sure I've taken a risk in my life, actually. But I suspect your approach is slightly different, Adam.
That's quite interesting. You view me as the risk taker. I've maybe outside of this call, you're gonna have to give some evidence for that. What about you, Simon? Now you work for TFT, True Freedom Trust. Do you think, does TFT have a line on this? Take a risk or play it safe?
I mean, I lead the speaking work for TFT, so it probably depends, like, which of my hats am I wearing at any one time. I feel like there's some speaking engagements you go to where you might encounter a little bit of risk because you might be in a church where some people disagree with you. You can't be afraid to take the risk like that, can you? So,
indeed. In fact, I sort of feel like Living Out True Freedom Trust, just the very nature of this ministry, risk takers. Even you, Andy.
All right, that's probably true. I will concede that.
So in this series, we're chatting to some people who are new to the Living Out podcast, hearing their stories and how God has been at work in their lives. And today we have the great joy and honour of being joined by Simon. So welcome, Simon.
Hello. Good to be here.
And how are you doing?
Yes, very, very well, thank you. I was just saying, glad this isn't a video podcast because I'm surrounded by bits of dismantled furniture. I'm trying to renovate my house a little bit.
Okay. And does the renovation of the house, does that come easily and natural to you, or is that a bit of a battle?
Absolutely not. Anything that requires me to work with my hands is not my natural gifting at all. DIY, building new beds, which is what I was doing last week. I was rolling around on the floor for about 4 hours doing that. Not my idea of a pleasant afternoon.
No, I don't think that's my idea of a pleasant afternoon either. Well, Simon, we've already hinted, or even more than hinted, stated that you work for True Freedom Trust. Could you just introduce yourself and maybe tell us a little bit about True Freedom Trust?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, True Freedom Trust, it's been around for quite a long time. It was founded back in 1977. It was set up to really support Christians who experience same-sex attraction but want to live in accordance with the historic Christian understanding of sex and marriage. I became a member of TFT back in 2018. And somehow actually ended up working for them later that year. I don't know how that happened either, but that's what happened. And I actually started out as the tech guy. So my background when I was a university student was I did a degree in sort of IT and business, but sort of since then I've pivoted and I'm more looking after the sort of speaking and teaching work now.
Simon, it's great to have you with us. I guess we've got you with us because you've got a story to tell about being a Christian and being attracted to people of the same sex. So let's unpack both of those if we can. Have you always known from sort of growing up that you're attracted to people of the same sex? Can you tell us a little bit of your story in that regard?
Sure. So I guess sometimes when I tell this story, people think that I was kind of aware of my attractions from quite a young age. I mean, I must have been sort of 9-10 years old, sort of having those experiences of difference, noticing that I was more attracted to my male peers than my female peers, etc. And for me, I mean, I grew up at a time, I was a teenager in the noughties, are we allowed to call them that? 2000, 2010, I was a teenager then, and that was very much an era where you just didn't tell your peers that you were gay, that you experienced attraction to the same sex. So I was already this really sort of skinny, pale, nerdy kid. I've already said that I'm not very good with my hands. I wasn't very good at playing football either. So I didn't play football with the rest of the lads at break time. And for me, actually, I just didn't really want to give anybody any more reason to pick on me than what it felt like they already had. So while I was aware of these sort of attractions, I really didn't do anything about them, didn't tell anybody about them, didn't act upon them, etc. Yeah, just kind of pushed it to the back of my mind and ignored it.
Yeah, that sounds pretty much like my story, though I wasn't a teenager in the noughties. It was a little bit before that. But yeah, no, I remember those school experiences as well. Do you want to tell us about becoming a Christian? Was that following this awareness of being different in certain ways? Was it before? How did you become a Christian?
Yeah, so I mean, I didn't grow up in a Christian household. When I was growing up, I was sort of an only child in a single parent family. It was just me and my mum when I was growing up. And mum was always one of these people who was sort of, well, I think I believe in Jesus, but I very much kind of do that in my own way. So we didn't go to church. We didn't really talk about faith at all. For me, that journey actually started when I was in sixth form. And it was off the back of a friend of mine who was just really persistent, sort of inviting me to church. And I just thought that church was kind of all smells, bells and things that I wasn't really interested in. So I kind of ignored those invitations. But eventually what happened was he invited me to his baptism. And I wanted to be a good, supportive friend. This clearly meant a lot to him. It was one of the big events of his life, I guess. So I agreed to go to this baptism. And he sort of got me into church via stealth, I guess you could say. It was one of those, renter baptisms where we went to a different building that had its own facilities on a Saturday because the church they were meeting at the time didn't. Went to his baptism. We all went to his house afterwards for a bit of an after party. We all stayed the night, and then lo and behold, Sunday morning we all ended up going to his church together. And what I didn't realise was the church he'd been inviting me to was right round the corner from where I was living at the time. It was literally a 3-minute walk door to door. And I ended up just sort of going week in, week out, really. A lot of people that I knew from college were there. It was nice to sort of see them in a different social setting. And I was kind of just treating church as a bit of a social club. And I guess what changed was we eventually went on a youth weekend away. So I live in the northwest of England. So we went up to the Lake District, a little place called St John's in the Vale. And it was the pastor of the church who was speaking that weekend. And it must have been the first time that I was really listening to him. Because I don't know what it was, but I came away feeling like that I'd heard something that was true. And I'd heard something that I needed to respond to. And I had this sort of niggling sensation in the back of my mind for about 2 weeks that I couldn't get rid of, that I did need to do something with what I'd heard that weekend. So it was about 2 weeks before I started university, actually, as an 18-year-old, that I sort of acknowledged Christ's lordship of my life and gave my life to Christ.
Oh, I just love hearing stories like that. Was sexuality part of the wrestling at that point? Were you aware of Christian teaching on sexuality, or did that come afterwards?
Yeah, so I think, and I don't know where this knowledge came from. Maybe it was RE lessons at school. I don't know what it was. But I did become a Christian already having this awareness that it didn't feel like the Bible spoke too favourably of same-sex marriage, same-sex sexual activity. But to be honest, at the time, I think I had been spending so long just sort of ignoring my attractions and not telling anybody about them that it just felt like that was something that I could just keep doing. So certainly for my early Christian life, while I was aware of those attractions, I just thought, well, I can just continue to ignore them, not act upon them, not tell anybody about them, etc. There were various reasons for me that wasn't a really good long-term plan. One is the classic that churches can be quite marriage-focused. I certainly had the experience of other people trying to set me up with some of the girls my own age in church and having to, get adept at wriggling my way out of meeting them. But actually, one really key thing for me was my first church. It was really charismatic. It was an independent church. It often spoke about grace, God's kindness to us, the good things that he gives us as an undeserving people. And I just kind of felt like, well, I just feel like I'm following a rule book with this. I'm just aware of these sort of biblical prohibitions, those 5 or 6 clobber passages that you sometimes hear them being referred to as. And for me, it's just that following of a rule book just didn't feel very motivating. And And I had this sort of like toddler moment where I started to ask the question, why? You know, they say that's quite a major developmental milestone in a toddler's life, isn't it? You've probably taught a toddler the rules at that point. You know, they know to wash their hands after they've been to the toilet, but they don't actually know why they should do that and why it's something that's important. And actually, for me, it's been really helpful and real blessing to me, actually, of being involved with True Freedom Trust, is it's encouraged me to dig into the scriptures and sort of see that actually the way that God has ordered sexual ethics, that has something to do with what God's purposes for us as his people are. So yeah, push me to that greater place of understanding where actually I feel like in a strange way kind of get excited about this following of Christ in this particular area, even though it is obviously quite costly.
So go on, talk us through that in terms of the stuff that has meant you're excited about this, that it's moved from just following a rule book to something much richer. Tell me how that change came about.
Yeah, I think your very own Andrew Bunt wrote an article not too long ago where he talks about there being a little bit of a resurgence in thinking around what you call theological anthropology, which is this sort of study of what it means to be human. And our starting place for that is you go right back into the creation accounts in Genesis and you get those twin parallel truths where, you know, we're created in the image of God and we're also created male and female. And for me, it's that we see and learn those two truths about ourselves, and then immediately afterwards, in the very next verse, we see God giving us a set of instructions, which is to go forth and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and sort of act as vice-regents, rulers under God, kind of stewarding God's creation. And just the fact that those two truths were so closely related, like how we're made, has something to do with what God's instructions for us are. You sort of, it's like God is saying sort of the end result of you carrying out this instruction to go out and multiply and fill the earth with people made in my image. The end result of that is that you get an earth that is full of people who are walking in relationship with God and following him in relationship with him and kind of carrying out his purposes. And that's there's just a wonderful parallel with just the New Testament, the Great Commission. We go out and we make disciples of all nations. Actually, the end result of those two instructions is the same. As we go out and we make disciples of all nations now, because obviously people have fallen away from God, we're contributing towards the world being full of a people in relationship with God, carrying out his purposes. And that's a wonderful thing. It just kind of changes your whole worldview. It's like sex isn't about pleasure. It's not about what we can get out of it, all the things that culture says it is. Actually, it's got a much deeper significance, which is connected for our very sort of purpose for being.
That's fascinating because it speaks into something we talk about a lot, which is the sort of transition that you get where, particularly in the New Testament, you have a family that is spiritually defined rather than just physically defined. How actually the Great Commission in terms of growing God's people these days is not just about producing offspring, it's much richer and deeper than that. And means it's just really exciting. It means we can find our fulfillment as those who are single. In a sense, we're still very much part of God's great plan for the world, and that's really exciting, actually.
Yeah, and the idea of fulfillment being found in the creator and not the created.
No, that's great, Simon. And you mentioned earlier on that when you were growing up, you thought sexuality was something not to talk about. I'm conscious this podcast won't just be the three of us; other people will hear it as well. Which means, I guess, you're more public now about your sexuality. Do you want to tell us what changed, and perhaps particularly how True Freedom Trust has been a good community for you to talk openly about sexuality?
Yeah, I mean, sort of the interesting thing was my sort of journey into True Freedom Trust. I actually joined this random online group before I joined TFT, which was full of other Christians in a very similar position who experienced attraction to the same sex and wanted to steward their sexuality in the way they should in the light of what they read in Scripture. And I sort of joined that and started chatting to a few people there, and obviously everybody was kind of in the same same boat. Everybody understood why everybody else was there. And that was what encouraged me to actually kind of go and get some kind of in-person community. And I joined TFT via that route. I think a big part of what TFT does pastorally is it puts people into community and puts people into, good friendships with other people who understand the particular cost of discipleship that they're carrying. And I think as I was kind of sharing my story with people there and just learning more, as I've said already, about what the Bible teaches in this area, I just began to feel a little bit more confident to share that story more widely. And it's a bit strange, actually. I sort of ended up sort of volunteering to be involved in the teaching and speaking ministry that we have at TFT, in which I now lead. And that was just such a good experience. 'Cause I think for me, it's that my kind of story. It isn't the kind of story that you're going to hear very often outside the church. And it's an immense privilege to kind of serve in a ministry, actually, where you kind of go out, you be a little bit vulnerable with your own testimony. You do that alongside some biblical teaching, and just the amount of times people come up to you after a speaking engagement and have conversations and that, we've never actually heard somebody speak so vulnerably about their own walk with Christ, often in any area, never mind sexuality. So some of that was just the confidence through being a part of TFT and talking to other people about my own experience, and some of that was just that these are stories that we're just not going to hear anywhere else other than in church, and just kind of wanting to be a part of helping other people in this area, helping people to think through these matters a little better.
That's great, Simon. I'd say exactly the same. Funnily enough, speaking on this is quite a weird thing to do, but you are just conscious of a huge privilege the Lord's given you of actually being able to speak truth and hope into the deepest areas of life. And at Living Out, we're so thankful for our partnership with TFT. We don't run fellowship groups, encouragement groups in the same way. And so when we have contact with people for whom it's a personal issue or their families, the fact that we can point people in TFT's direction is just wonderful for us. So we are very grateful to you.
And likewise, I think actually it was on the Living Out website is the first place I heard about TFT. You must have a better SEO guy than us.
We are so excited about Kaleidoscope, the series that gives you the chance to wrestle with big questions about sexuality, gender and faith.
People often ask us, are you kind of living a lie because of my sexuality?
I was always rebelling against this idea of being a female, I think because I felt so different from the other girls.
Kaleidoscope is a video-based series for use in youth groups designed to help young people explore big questions on sexuality, gender and faith.
The actual relationship that I left in order to follow Jesus was with a woman that I intended to spend the rest of my life with.
Each episode has real-life stories, engaging teaching and a panel discussion. And alongside the videos, there's training, episode guides, take-home sheets and a load of bonus material for use before and after the series, giving churches everything they need to help young people explore these big topics.
And when I became a Christian, read the Bible for myself, I saw, no, you know what, there's actually a much bigger story going on here.
We turn to him as sinners, and actually he responds with grace and with love.
Kaleidoscope launches on the 1st of November. Head to livingout.org to find out more and to sign up to be the first to notified when the series is available.
Thank you, Simon, for being so open and honest with us, and just for speaking so clearly about the goodness of God in these areas of sexuality. And it's so encouraging to hear how you found just good support and community within TFT, True Freedom Trust. That's just amazing to hear. But we also know that these things aren't always plain sailing. And so could you maybe tell us the story of the first person you ever told about your sexuality?
Yeah, and it's probably quite a timely story to tell. It will have happened by the time this podcast goes live, I'm sure, but we're doing a conference in London next week around the theme of emotional dependency. And often, actually, we spend a great deal of time sort of talking about the sexual side of same-sex attraction, sort of struggling with that physical and sexual temptation. But there is a sort of emotional and romantic element to it as well. And for me, the first person who I ever kind of told about my same-sex attraction, that was in my early 20s. And there was a particular friend of mine who I was really kind of struggling with feelings for. I basically fell kind of head over heels in love with the guy. And it sort of, it felt like I ended up at a place where my entire sense of happiness depended upon my access to this particular person. And, you know, that's never really a good place to get to with anybody in your life other than Jesus Christ, because, you know, all created beings, we're all marred by the effects of sin. We're all going to let each other down in some way. We're never going to be able to live up to unrealistic expectations of each other. And I certainly felt like I had unrealistic expectations of him. So yeah, what kind of ended up happening was it was just really my feelings for him and my wanting to be around him all the time were just really just negatively affecting our friendship. You know, I found myself getting like jealous when he was hanging out with other people. I found myself kind of like trying to engineer social situations where we'd come across each other a little bit more often. So just really not healthy. And because it was so negatively affecting our friendship, eventually I just got to the point where I thought, actually, things really aren't working here, and I think I know what's going on. So yeah, like I say, a sort of a teary conversation over a coffee was when I told him, and he was the first Christian friend who knew.
Okay. Oh, thank you for being so open and honest about that. After you had that conversation with him, how did the Lord then help you through those next few days, weeks, months? What did the Lord teach you in that time?
Yeah, I mean, thankfully, even though I guess it was a bit of a double whammy of news for him, it's like, oh, I'm same-sex attracted. Oh, and also, by the way, I'm in love with you. Bit of a double whammy. You know, his response was actually a really, really positive, really gracious, really caring one. And, you know, we did maintain a friendship after that. We ended up drifting apart just because we moved to different bits of the country in the end. But, you know, it certainly didn't feel like it actually affected or had any bearing on us having a friendship at all. One thing actually that I found really useful in terms of a helpful resource was it's a book where I think Paul David Tripp was one of the authors, and it's called Relationships, A Mess Worth Making. And it was actually kind of the first few chapters of that I found most helpful. And he talks about this idea of our relationships being on a little bit of a spectrum sometimes. And he sort of says you get people who at one end of this sort of spectrum are people that sort of immerse themselves in relationships, who dive in head on, have quite high expectations in terms of the intimacy they experience with the other person. And on the other end of the spectrum, you've got people who sort of isolate themselves. Everybody has this sort of God-given, I've heard some people describe it as like an Edenic ache for intimacy with other people, which is a good desire. We're built to need each other and enjoy fellowship with one another. But actually, those are the two ways it can go wrong. We can either over-immerse ourselves in particular relationships, or we can isolate ourselves from actually good relationships, which sort of precludes our desires for intimacy. And you know, that can vary depending on the friendship, the particular person you're connected to that you're thinking about. But he says that actually, for a lot of us, our problems in friendships and relationships tend to cluster at one end of the spectrum. And that experience really taught me that actually I have a particular issue with my sort of experience clustering at that immersion end of the spectrum for whatever reason. And then he goes into sort of talking about how our own sinful desires can sort of affect relationships, you know, whether we're just in it for kind of our self-pleasure or whatever it may be. And he talks about actually here are the things that you're willing to sort of sacrifice for sort of feeding that particular unhealthy relationship. And for me, I was kind of like not hanging out with other friends because I particularly wanted to hang out with this person, which is just completely like counter what the Lord wants us to be doing, right? He wants us to be in immersive Christian community. And actually, when I was doing some theological study a few years ago, the best way I can illustrate this was one of our lecturers. He talked about the importance of, when you're studying theology, sort of surrounding yourself with a team. And he said it used to be trendy in the academic world in the 80s, 90s, where everybody had a mentor, an academic mentor, somebody that would help them along, you know, get to the next stage in being able to write well or whatever it is. And he sort of said, well, it's great, you need that mentor, but you also need the prayer person, you need the proofreader, you need the person, you know, the surrounding army of people that are going to be praying for you in the background, maybe financially supporting you. And that's just a wonderful picture of actually the Christian walk, because we shouldn't have all of our eggs in one basket. Whether we're single or married, the Lord wonderfully blesses different Christians with different gifts, and we're only going to truly allow the Lord to minister to us through other people if we do surround ourselves with different people who are able to speak to us in different ways.
Let's continue down this line here, Simon, because I'd love to hear just more advice that you might have on doing friendships well. Like either as a same-sex attracted person or someone who's a friend with a same-sex attracted person, what advice would you give on doing friendships well?
Yeah, Jill, the interesting thing actually is thinking about TFT. Sometimes I say that at TFT, people get to know each other in the wrong order. It's like everybody is at a conference and everybody's in the same boat and everybody knows. It's like, oh yeah, you're here because you're same-sex attracted, etc. And then you sort of get talking to people, and then several months down the line, you're like, oh, I didn't know you had a pet dog. Which usually things we find out about people early in a friendship happen much later in TFT circles. And actually, it kind of shows that one of the marks of good quality, deep friendship is having this level of honesty and this level of vulnerability with one another. Quite a lot of my closest friends now are people who I've met through TFT in some way. And actually, funnily enough, the other people who I would describe as close friends of mine who aren't TFT members are often people that I've served alongside, doing like church ministry with, or doing some outreach work with, some evangelism with. And actually, there's real benefit in, if we want to grow healthy relationships with other people, making sure we're doing activities where we're kind of stood shoulder to shoulder looking outward at a particular task or a particular mission, whatever it may be, rather than sort of spending all of our time face to face staring at each other. That's something that's been really helpful as well. I think actually the particularly difficult thing about friendship, there's a lot of people I know at TFT struggle with friendship in various different ways. The problem with friendship actually often is our role in creating good, deep friendships is simply that we have to kind of try and sow the best possible conditions for a relationship to thrive. The issue is we're also kind of relying on another person doing the same thing, because friendship is a reciprocal thing, right? Yeah, so that's been a kind of challenge for me. It's like, am I doing all I can in my life to make sure I am creating the best possible conditions for a friendship to survive and flourish and bloom? Am I, making sure we're being mission-minded and we're looking at God and we're looking at how we can serve His purposes in creation? Am I making sure I'm being appropriately honest and vulnerable with people? Things like that.
Now, Simon, even when we feel like we do have those good friendships and we're working hard to create those appropriate conditions, like lots of SSA people do still find themselves to be single, and without a family they can feel quite lonely. Have you got any thoughts on that? Yeah, so this is one thing that I've had to wrestle with quite recently. So I mentioned earlier, my backstory is only child, single parent family, and about 3 years ago my mum passed away. And that was to do with cancer, and it happened very, very quickly, and it was all a bit of a shock. But for me, actually, that's kind of left me in a place where I don't have any sort of direct blood relatives of my own. Which obviously, if you're part of a sort of a nuclear family, you'll have a husband or a wife, you might have children, etc. Obviously, I don't have siblings either, so I really don't have any direct blood relatives of my own. And it was this sort of strange story where the place that hit me was actually in A&E. And it was a few weeks after my mum had passed away. And so basically what had happened was I was due to, we were clearing out my mum's house where she used to live. And I'd woken up the morning that I was going to go and meet my uncle, and we were going to do like the big bits of furniture. And I woke up that morning and I had this strange pain in my right knee. And I had no idea what it was. I just assumed that I'd slept funny or something, and it had just, as I loosened up a little bit throughout the day, as I was getting on with it, it'd just go away. So, I just got on with my day, etc. And it was while I was at my mum's house, like actually dismantling her bed, that it started to get quite a bit more painful. And I'm like, oh, this is a bit strange, but whatever. I'm quite busy, so I'll just get on with the day. And then it got to, I was back home. It was about 10 o'clock in the evening, and honestly, it felt like my kneecap was about to blow up. I was sort of dragging myself around the house. I couldn't walk properly. And it's one of those where I did a quick phone call to 111, and they said,
this is a bit weird. We think you probably need to go to A&E if this hadn't happened to you before and you don't know what it was. And I got to A&E and I was there on my own, and I was stood talking to the receptionist, and she sort of said, look, just in case anything happens to you while you're here, if you go into cardiac arrest or something like that. I'm like, well, how bad is this need going to be that you think that might happen? But she said, just in case something like that happens, who would you want us to call? Like, who's your next of kin? Who's your emergency contact? And I just froze, because like the sort of answer that I would have given all through my life up until that point would have been my mum. And I just didn't know how to answer that question. And it was just one of those where I'm like, oh, hang on, yeah, probably not going to get married, probably not going to have any children, don't have any siblings, parents passed away. I'm going to need to think about these sort of practical details of actually what does it kind of mean to be family? Who can I possibly put down in this situation to be my emergency contact? If something goes wrong, if I get ill, etc., who can I kind of call upon? And yeah, it's interesting because obviously there's a lot of sort of default legal mechanisms in the UK. Like, if the worst happened and you passed away and you were married, if you didn't have a will, it's pretty clear to whom your estate would go. And it's all of these little things that I've had to kind of think through, like, getting a will, do I need to get power of attorney, etc. And it's just really interesting, actually, because one of the wonderful truths of the Christian faith is, of course, adoption, this idea of God setting us in a family of Christian brothers and sisters who share this sort of common parent as God as our Father. And I found myself sort of having those conversations with Christian friends of mine. It's like, oh, would you be willing to be the person that I put down when my kneecap is about to blow up in A&E? And yeah, just trying to make the most of those Christian friendships, pushing them into places that kind of aren't particularly normative of friendship in our culture. And I guess that's the challenge, right? Because these sort of things, it is often driven by sort of cultural norms. We don't often think of our friendships as having such a degree of commitment that we would expect a friend to necessarily drop everything and come find us if we were in A&E somewhere. But actually, in a Christian sense, it's our brothers and sisters in Christ. Those are relationships that really, really matter. Those are the people we're going to be spending an eternity with. So I'm sure a few hours in A&E will be fine.
Amen, indeed. So if you know how to write down who's going to be your emergency contact next of kin, would you now be able to put a name down?
Yeah, absolutely. Funnily enough, it is a TFT friend of mine, and sort of that's a little bit mutual. He's got a couple of health things himself, and I get his he's got diabetes, so I get his blood sugar levels through to my phone.
But that is just such a beautiful example of two brothers loving and caring for each other and spurring each other on. Oh, stunning! That's stunning. Okay, we're coming into land now with my final question for you. Slightly different angle. I'd like you to imagine the younger Simon, probably a bit more hair than you have now. What advice would you give to your younger self?
That's why Adam isn't my emergency contact. I just get abuse. Yeah, what advice would I give to my younger self? I think the fact that I waited so long to be a little bit more open about my same-sex attraction in my sort of church setting, it's funny that actually a lot of people who we sort of minister to past True Freedom Trust, they sort of report feeling like a little bit of a walking contradiction. Because on the one hand, they've got this sort of set of desires to be in a same-sex relationship. On the other hand, they've got this desire to love and worship and serve the Lord as they believe they should, as I say, in the light of what they read in Scripture. And I think for me, I spent a long time wrestling with that feeling of being a walking contradiction, on my own. And feeling quite lonely and isolated. Certainly when I was at my first church, I remember just thinking I must be the only Christian in the world that's wrestling with this. And then lo and behold, 10 years down the line, I joined TFT and we've got 1,500 members who are all wrestling with the same thing. But actually that sense of loneliness and isolation, that for me only increased the sense of temptation that I felt to go off and do things that I didn't want to do. And there were certainly times when I, stumbled and fell short of what I think the Bible teaches in this area. And I could have probably saved myself just a lot of heartache and a lot of sleepless nights if I'd have just shared with a few trusted Christian allies a little bit sooner than I did. But I recognise that, everybody's situation will be quite unique in that regard. And some people will feel better surrounded with brothers and sisters they might be able to trust with that than others.
Oh, thank you so much, Simon. Thank you for your openness. Thank you for your honesty. Thank you for your wisdom. That's all that we've got time for in today's episode. And thank you everyone for listening. Please do rate and share this podcast if you liked it. And please do subscribe so that you never miss an episode. Thank you, Andy, and thank you, Simon. You can read more and hear more from Simon on the True Freedom Trust website, and we'll put a link to that in our show notes. But for now, it's goodbye.